Hello and good morning, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Tuesday, the 3rd of February, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Robert, good morning. Let's jump inside the Beltway. Starting with this, I saw this headline and I looked into it, and it doesn't look great. It's a little more innocuous than what the headlines read, but apparently President Trump told Dan Bongino yesterday that he thought Republicans ought to nationalize elections.
Good morning, Mike. Correct. He did say this during an interview with the former deputy FBI director. Specifically, he said that Republicans should say that they want to take over elections and take over voting in at least 15 places. I think he means 15 states, probably specifically Democrat states. I think this is really just more of Trump thinking out loud, putting ideas out, because there isn't really a mechanism for this other than a constitutional amendment, which is basically not going to happen because Article 1 of the Constitution gives states power over elections rather than the federal government.
Mm-hmm. I guess if you're on the Trump side, can maybe see the logic in this. You have, let's just say, a city like Philadelphia, which is just notoriously corrupt as a city. And we saw what happened in the 2020 elections. And you obviously want to prevent what happened then from happening in the future, like the mail-in ballots, the no signature verification, all the things that happened. And we're not going to relitigate this stuff from 2020. Mail-in ballots that continued to be counted well after the date they're supposed to. And so I can see the reasoning here. You say, well, this is notoriously corrupt, and it's potentially turning purple states blue just through the manufacture of ballots or however they're sourcing ballots. But then the other side says, well, you should probably investigate and find criminal wrongdoing and prosecute them. And that's how you make elections fair, not by, I think everyone can pretty much agree that it's unconstitutional for the federal government to do something like this.
Well, I think if the Trump administration were serious about this, they would probably push for the Republican Party, state level Republican parties, to start passing laws. So one of the big things that happened after DeSantis was elected here, he implemented some specific regulations around elections, not necessarily ending mail-in ballots completely, but one of the big things he did was effectively make it so that there was more vetting of people involved in like get out the vote efforts and voter registration efforts. And one of that seemed to have a big impact on elections here, because Florida, for a long time, Florida was the swing state in the United States, and now is pretty reliably Republican. And I don't think necessarily the federal government could even have an impact on the use of mail-in ballots. I think that would still likely fall under the state's power over elections of how they're conducted.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the SAVE Act.
Rep. Anna Paulina Luna, who's a representative from here in Florida, said that the House conservatives that were holding up the vote on must-pass spending bills in the House got assurances from the Senate Majority Leader John Thune that he would hold a vote to attempt to pass the SAVE Act. Luna said that specifically he was going to use a parliamentary procedure, the standing filibuster rule, which could allow the SAVE Act to pass by a simple majority. It's possible that this doesn't happen, but the method they're using would allow a 50, even a tie vote with Vice President J.D. Vance breaking the tie. And according to Luna, the White House supports this maneuver and wants the SAVE Act passed. This would, I think, give Republicans another advantage heading into the midterms, because the SAVE Act requires voter ID for elections. Speaking of elections, President Donald Trump's political action committees and the RNC have raised $483 million as of December 2025. And in these FEC filings, they showed that the Democratic National Committee and both of their leadership PACs in the House and Senate reported only $167 million in funds raised. There is, according to somebody that's familiar with the Trump administration's midterm strategy, they plan to start the spending ahead of the 2026 primary elections. I think the base case is still that Democrats flip at least one chamber of Congress, likely the House more than the Senate. But to me, it looks like the Trump inner circle and the White House are really gearing up to try to give Republicans as much momentum as possible heading into the midterms, because they're Republicans, I think, have one advantage here, is that there are 3 non-voting delegates that are Republicans. So while they only have a 1 vote margin in the House right now, they still have a 4-seat majority. So I think they're likely to maintain that in 2026. Also, the Institute for Supply Management released their latest manufacturing index, and they said in January it rose from 47.9 to 52.6, which was the fastest increase since 2022. If the index is over 50, that indicates growth. They also said that the manufacturing job index increased by 3.3 points. It's still below 50, but according to ISM, it's showing that there is a slowing of manufacturing job losses. And finally, in an interview with a far left media outlet, a communications workers of America Local president Kieran Knutson in Minneapolis said that labor unions have been involved in scaling up the anti-ICE rapid response groups. They've also been involved in planning these economic blackout days of action, and that they have organized a coalition of different ethnic groups and different labor groups within Minneapolis and within Minnesota to put these together. I think this is a pretty strong confirmation of the idea that this economic blackout was kind of a structure test for a larger general strike. Though I did see another far left report back that said that this group that was behind the 23rd January strike was not part of organizing the following Friday, 30 January strike, and that was likely the Party for Socialism and Liberation. But I think that the numbers that they claim turned out in just Minneapolis for this economic blackout, I think they saw this as successful, and I expect them to push more of these economic blackout days of action.
Mm-hmm. Robert, this goes back to the Obama administration, and you had not only administration officials, but also this coterie of progressives talking about how do you rebuild the muscle from these unions, basically. And there's a lot of talk about union militancy and regaining some of that power that they had back at the height of the unions, where they would endorse candidates and they would, unions were a massive get out the vote effort. And not only that, but they also had social and economic power, and then they had the option to walk off the job or strike. I mean, they just had a lot of tools and a lot of different ways to exercise that kind of power. And then for a long time, unions have fallen out of favor, and we have seen these efforts to rebuild these unions. I mean, probably half of the community organizing material stuff out there is about building unions. And there are these efforts called salting, and we've seen this with Amazon and a lot of other corporations, where if I understand this correctly, union officials are banned from being on the shop floor, or what they call the shop floor. Basically, if you're a union official, you can't just go in and start talking to the workers. So the way they get around that is they hire community organizers, or in this case, union organizers. And this process is called salting. And then the union organizer goes and gets a job at this warehouse or factory or wherever they are, and then starts this campaign of, typically they're, this is almost like a special forces ODA, getting access or entering a country, infiltrating into a country, and then linking up with the guerrillas. I mean, this is almost very similar process, except it happens in a factory. But you have this initial contact by this union organizer, typically with someone on the inside. So you typically have a group of people, maybe an individual, small group of people that say, hey, we want to organize our workplace. They get in touch with the unions turn around, hire a union organizer, and then get this person a job at this factory. And now you have this very highly capable, well-trained union organizer that goes around and starts in the course of official duties while he or she is working at this place. Then they go around and they start building support and having these conversations. And really it's inform and influence until they have roughly 50%. And so at any rate, there's just a lot of literature out there that I've read about just how highly organized and successful this is. So it really should not surprise anyone that as there's this effort to rebuild the unions, that unions are going to start using that power, that political, social, and economic power, towards rapid response, towards anti-ICE, towards anything, any of these main lines of effort that we're seeing on the left. Robert, thanks for bearing with that explanation. Anything to add there?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move over to the global sit rep. Starting with the latest on Cuba. We've been talking about Cuba. We put them on the short list for regime change, and then Maduro happened, and then, Jared, it's pretty much like, yeah, Cuba's going to happen too. So most recently, President Trump said that he's currently dealing with Cuban leaders. So what's the latest?
Yeah, he kind of snuck this in on his normal, oh, they're a failed state, nobody's giving them any money, but did say we are dealing with the Cuban leaders right now. This is confirmation that they are at least trying to have a peaceful change of state. And the U.S. ambassador to Cuba has actually been basically walking around doing on the ground work for the past several weeks as well. So I think we're going to see this, and I don't think it's going to have to go the same way as Maduro did. We're going to stay very heavy in Latin America today. Over the weekend, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, Laura Dogu, actually arrived in Venezuela. She's going to oversee the operations of the embassy down there. So not quite the ambassador, but close. And yesterday she had her first meeting with Venezuelan President Rodriguez to reiterate the plan for Venezuela from the United States. And those will be stabilization, economic recovery, and then transition. And transition is toward democracy. Over in Colombia, well, kind of over in Colombia, actually over in D.C., the Colombian president is scheduled to meet with President Trump today. We previewed this a couple of weeks ago, but they're going to specifically address the points of challenge from the last year, which we've covered extensively. This will include hemispheric interests and drug statistics and trafficking in Colombia. And then lastly, an internal document from the Vietnamese Ministry of Defense was leaked. Now, this document is from 2024. It is a bit old, but they said that they were preparing for a possible American war of aggression, basically a second Vietnam War, and considered the United States to be a belligerent power. And the reason they had this mentality was that they were concerned the U.S. in 2024 was going to spread and impose its values, or overthrow the Vietnamese government gradually. This indicates that Vietnam's not going to join the anti-China coalition. They're not going to put stock in the United States when this document is so recent. So we can move them back to neutral. But I don't think Vietnam's the only one that's viewing the United States this way. There are likely numerous other countries concerned that the U.S. will demand they become a democracy when they are not. And this shows the importance of that clause that you and I, Mike, have pointed out numerous times from the National Security Strategy, quoting, "We must not overlook governments with different outlooks with whom we nonetheless share interests and want to work with us." Basically, we'll work with you regardless of your government type. That is setting people that is intended to set people at ease.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jared, as I understand it, Vietnam is kind of between a rock and a hard place. Okay, this document's from 2024. They said they're maybe preparing for an American war of aggression. On the flip side, they're just getting pummeled and bullied by China constantly. Yeah. And to the point where India has been giving Navy ships to, I guess, older decommissioned, but they're giving Navy ships to Vietnam just so Vietnam has at least some semblance of a Navy. I get if you're in that part of the world and you see American foreign policy change so rapidly, roughly every 4 years, or say, give or take 4 years. And I kind of get that unwillingness to work with the United States. On the other hand, do you just have to have a foregone conclusion that the United States is going to lose most or maybe all of its power and influence in that part of the world? I mean, is that the calculus here for looking at this and saying, well, we can't do business. We can't be on the pro-U.S. anti-China side?
I think for Vietnam it is just because they border China. The U.S. may lose power and influence somewhat, but particularly in the region of Vietnam, it is likely that the U.S. in a protracted war would lose influence there because it's on the border of China. That doesn't mean it would lose influence in the Pacific, though. It's honestly, I think Vietnam's, because they are between a rock and a hard place, they are just trying to figure out how they can continue to exist between two superpowers, and likely with a war literally on their maritime border, the South China Sea. They're not in a good place.
Haven't we talked about this? If China does at some point start looking at kind of imperial expansion, Vietnam has to be pretty close to the top of that list.
Yeah, they've already tried it once.
Right.
And they what kicked that off was also Chinese imperial expansion. They grabbed the paracels from Vietnam. Yeah, it's Vietnam. Like I said, they're not in a good place because they're worried about the existence of their government, but also just the existence of their territory between the two of these. They're going to have to try to secure it in some way. And that's probably why they're going to India, by the way, because India's neutral, sort of.
All right. And Miss the 70s actually does bring up some good history. This would actually be maybe a fourth conflict. I read this book about France and Indochina. So this was not technically Vietnam at the time, but it was Indochina. And when the Japanese came through, Indochina, present day Vietnam, was a French colony. And then World War II happened and the Japanese came through. And the author of this book was explaining how when the Japanese came through, they completely destroyed all of the French intelligence networks in Indochina, present day Vietnam. And so then after the cessation of hostilities, once the Japanese left, the French came back in and they struggled very heavily because all of their intelligence networks had been destroyed due to Japanese war and I guess probably occupation. And so the author was basically saying this is one reason why the Viet Minh were able to kick out the French. But yes, Indochina conflict, followed by Vietnam, followed by that 1979 border skirmish between China and Vietnam. And Viet Minh undefeated here. So, pound for pound, probably wouldn't want to mess with those guys. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Anything else to add there?
Yeah, just one last thing for them. Keep in mind when we've previously talked about like Thailand and Cambodia, that is next door to Vietnam. Their general, that peninsula, the Southeast Asian peninsula, is just not stable. So they have to constantly worry about this. Like, where are the extra threats coming from? I think Vietnam's going to sit it out, from being perfectly frank. They're going to sit everything out as much as they can.
All right. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on to the Homeland Ops brief. Lots going on, Robert. And I think starting this week, we're going to start doing a recap the last 24 hours of political violence because as we get closer to March and warmer weather, we are, I think, all expecting the spring offensive. The summer could be quite warm. You might even say hot. So we're gearing up for that. So, Robert, please go ahead.
Yesterday, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said that DHS is going to deploy body cams on all ICE and CBP agents that are currently in Operation Metro Surge. Noem said that eventually they are going to expand this to all ICE and CBP operations nationwide. I think what's going to happen here is we're going to start to see activists actively opposing this body cam push, while this is really a deal to help try to ease the way for Democrats in the House and Senate to vote on this DHS continuing resolution. These body cams were really started being pushed heavily during the Obama era. Since then, a lot of activists have recognized that this actually did not work out the way they thought it would. I think most recently there was an interview put out by the author of Propaganda saying that body cams are actually, in his words, something to the effect of like pro-regime propaganda. I do think that this is going to give a lot more on the ground footage of what's going on in Minneapolis, because activists in Minneapolis, the anti-ICE movement and far left militants have been actively trying to restrict what type of footage is able to come out of on the ground activities, including, I think most recently online, famously, a physical attack on Will Stancil, who was a candidate for local office in Minneapolis in 2024. So I expect to see a lot more footage come out. I think there's a possibility here that the DHS and the Trump administration recognize that there is an information operations opportunity here by increasing the amount of footage that can be leveraged to effectively inform the Americans at large of what is actually happening on the ground. FAA also issued a notice to Air Missioner NOTAM on the 16th of January, and they have effectively created roving no-fly zones for all DHS operations. And they've also increased their use of drones. And they awarded a $514,000 contract to buy some smaller drones that have some capabilities to allow them to surveil and pick surveillance targets out of some of these anti-ICE movement activities. Also, earlier or late last week, independent journalist Ken Klippenstein claimed that a DHS source told him that DHS and the FBI are using more than a dozen watch list programs to track anti-ICE activists, Antifa affinity groups, and pro-Palestine activists. Klippenstein has demonstrated previously that he does have access to sources, and some of those sources so far have appeared credible. In this case, he did not provide any kind of documentation. I think it's likely because he's citing a DHS lawyer who is probably much more aware of the legalities of leaking and talking to the media. Though I do think there is a program like this happening, even if it's not these specific programs that Klippenstein cites, because Homeland has mentioned, I think we talked about a week ago, that he has been pushing DHS to create a database of anti-ICE activists.
Yeah, I think this is more likely than not true. I don't have any reason to doubt this whatsoever. Robert, you are right. Klippenstein has proved that he does have access to people because officials in the administration and in the National Guard and other places, because they do leak information to him. Was it 6 months ago? Maybe he published a slide from a ConOps brief of a National Guard unit, basically a concept of operations, explaining exactly what they are doing in Los Angeles. So obviously he does have sympathetic people leaking to him. Also, I've never worked at DHS. I don't know exactly what they have, but we all know they have watch lists. I mean, everybody knows they have databases for stuff, and that obviously cuts both ways. Robert, I continue to see at least some people in this administration understand exactly what this is. And these are not simple protests. Everyone by now, I mean, I knew it in November 24, this was not going to be simple protests, just like it wasn't simple protests starting in 2016 and 2017. This is actually revolutionary activity. It is, I see people in the chat every day talking about sedition. Why isn't this being labeled sedition? And by the definition, some of this stuff absolutely could be labeled as sedition, the stuff that we're seeing out there, especially revolutionary rhetoric. And there is someone asked me this the other day, and I just think there's a fine line between what is protected under the First Amendment, like what you say that you support or what you say that you want to do, or this communist utopia that you want to build after the revolution, which obviously implies a lot of death and destruction, and I guess taking concrete action in furtherance of that conspiracy or in furtherance of that revolution. So it seems to me like that is the line being drawn. And I will just go back to this just briefly. When we're talking about color revolution or insurgency or whatever, or organized resistance, remember, under a color revolution, the broad base of a color revolution is protest. You can continue to build that broad base because you are a protest organization. This is all you're doing. You're expressing your opposition to the administration or to these policies or to the government or against whomever, which is protected under the First Amendment. The broad base of an insurgency is not protest. It is far more seditious. And so I think there, also it's going to be a lot more difficult, probably impossible for the administration to legally go after this color revolution movement. And it would be far easier to go after a burgeoning insurgency or a proto-insurgency or whatever potentially we're looking at right now. So I'll just frame that up for another reason why I think the progressive left, the establishment left, is pursuing a color revolution, because they can build this for years under the auspices of the First Amendment. And it's a lot more difficult to do that with a lot more dangerous and seditious activity that you would see in the early phases of an insurgency. Point being, in all this, is we continue to see little pieces of the Trump administration, it looks like, understanding maybe slowly, what they're up against and trying to document this stuff. And, it's another reason why I think everyone should expect, this summer obviously is going to heat up. 27 probably continue to trudge along. 28, again, I mean, I think everyone could just make it a key assumption, put it on your calendar. You don't need me to tell you this, but these things take time to build. And when you're like 2-3+ years into this, 2-3+ years into organizing and training cadres and establishing human infrastructure and establishing communications infrastructure and establishing financial support and funding sources and facilitators and getting your people in place and trained up and organized. This is a far more dangerous movement 2 years from now than it was last year or today. So we continue to see, Robert, I continue to see folks on both sides just flashing red indicators that we're going to see something on the order of 2020. That's what it looks like to me. Anything else to add here?
Yeah, there were three things that stood out from Klippenstein's write-up in his source that I think are key here. One, the DHS lawyer said that these are not one organized effort. His analogy was that this is not the eye of Sauron. This is basically a multifaceted fly's eye. So he did point out that there is an effort, or there appears to be an effort, though, to organize all of this data collection. The second thing I think is important is that he pointed out that they're using a new category for these watch lists. They're calling them aggressive protesters. I think this is a recognition from DHS and the Trump administration that there is this protester, activist, militant pipeline, and there is some effort, even if it's unorganized right now, to start surveilling people who are moving through that pipeline. And then I think the third key point here is that these are not watch lists that were created by the Trump administration. So the DHS lawyer pointed out that a lot of these watch lists were actually started after January 6, 2021 during the Biden administration. And that, I think that goes to the point of the expanding the surveillance state effectively can be a double-edged sword. I think a lot of these watch lists were probably intended, other than the one that is specifically used to track Afghan immigrants who came in during the Biden administration. A lot of these were planned, I think, originally to track right-wing groups and political dissidents and January 6 protesters, and now the Trump administration is effectively taking control of them to go after a color revolution effort.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot more action is to come. That's for sure. Anything else to add here for Homeland Ops?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that, Robert. And we do have some questions that we will get to. Jared, if you could please tee those up. With non-state actors, with the non-state actors controlling an autonomous zone and starting to set up checkpoints, performing police actions and doing so with seemingly state blessing, at what point do the feds step in? Well, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Minneapolis PD or Hennepin County Sheriff's Office dismantled what they called that filter, the filter blockade or filter checkpoint. I think they did that.
They have dismantled all of these roadblocks over time, because there have been multiple. There was the one closer to downtown Minneapolis. There have been a couple of these put up. I think the reason why the feds don't step in, the federal government doesn't step in, because police powers rest with the state. It's up to the state or local authorities to deal with this or request assistance from the federal government. I think in this case they haven't, even though there is a deal and they are supposedly holding to it. I think there's probably political reasons why Walz has not requested federal assistance in dealing with this, because that I'm sure in their view that would actually inflame tensions on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have seen a huge shift in Minneapolis and this was part of this deal cut between President Trump and Governor Tim Walz, where we have seen Minneapolis PD come in and Hennepin County Sheriff's Office and actually start enforcing the law again. And, I look at this Border Patrol body cam thing, and that it seems to me like that may have been part of this deal for greater accountability that Democrat officials want. I'm with you. I think it's going to show exactly what it's like on the ground. I was talking with some guys in Minneapolis the other day, and they're like, "Oh, hey, we're about to go through this group of protesters. Maybe you don't even call them protesters. Maybe they're certainly activists. Maybe they have surpassed that to the point of militants. But you could hear them screaming and throwing stuff in the background, and that's just like a daily occurrence. These guys are like, "Oh yeah, we're just going through these guys again. Hey, it's going to be loud for a couple minutes, and then we'll get past them." So I do think the body cams are actually more likely to show wrongdoing of the activists and militants rather than necessarily wrongdoing from ICE. I'm not saying there's zero, but it does seem to me that that's far more likely to prove the case of we're not dealing with peaceful protest, or they are not dealing with peaceful protesters. They're dealing with activists and militants. Anything else to add here, Robert?
Yeah, so I think that's why there's much less footage, even from mainstream media outlets in Minneapolis right now, because that was a big thing the activists saw in 2020 that turned the Floyd's rebellion sentiment away from a lot of the public. We covered it a couple weeks ago or talked about it, that in 2020 public opinion polling did seem to support the BLM protests during the summer, and that peaked, but it dropped off very quickly. And I think a lot of that was due to the amount of footage that was made available, not just through CNN or MSNBC at the time, but also groups like Unicorn Riot putting out a lot of live stream footage. There's been a very apparent absence of that so far in Minneapolis. I think that's purposeful, a recognition from activists and far left militants in the anti-ICE movement that was counterproductive for their goal.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And just on this point briefly, and then we'll move on to the next question. Back in May 2024, you had Portland Police Bureau Chief, basically police chief, Bob Day, come out. And in this press conference, he said, we're not going to put up with, in so many words, he said, look, we're done acquiescing to Antifa. We're going to go out. We're arresting them. We're interrogating them. It's not a revolving door. I'm just telling you what he said. And he said, we're in so many words, he basically said, look, we're actually interrogating these people now, and we're trying to get information on their comrades to build out the network. And as soon as he started saying stuff like that, I'm like, oh, well, they're actively now using Analyst Notebook or whatever software they're using to flesh out and map this network. And when you flesh out and map a network and look for these nodes where the greatest power or influence rests, that is your effects-based targeting in a counterinsurgency. Like, you want to remove those key nodes. And that's not the only consideration, but that is one of them. And he talked about there was some national conference, and I'm not sure exactly what conference it was. He didn't say. But he said at this conference, these sheriffs and police chiefs were talking about adopting new strategies. Basically, I guess they had some kind of session or panel on lessons learned and best practices for countering Antifa and far left violence and insurrectionary violence in general. And so I looked at that and I said, something has obviously changed. And then you get into election night 2024, and you had that black bloc demonstration that was very short-lived in Seattle. And then for successive nights, Seattle Police Department were kettling and arresting these Antifa black bloc who were spray painting and marching down the street and yelling. And there were a bunch of bike cops. And basically these police officers were like zooming into this Antifa black bloc demonstration, hopping off their bikes and using their bikes as shield to kettle and arrest these guys. And I said, something has definitely changed. These Democrats who run these cities do not want to put up with this anymore. And obviously in Minneapolis, they have been far more amenable to that, but even that has changed. And I still do think Americans are tired of rioting. I think they're tired of this kind of lawlessness and this violence against law enforcement. Not all of them, obviously. But even after January 25th, you still have a majority of Americans say they support mass immigration enforcement. They support mass deportation. And I do think Democrats are a little bit behind the eight ball here, because when they allow that to happen, they do give President Trump this law and order platform. And I think maybe that's one reason why we'll continue to see, like we saw in Los Angeles, where Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom said, go out and protest, but do not get violent. Do not give Trump what he wants. That's exactly what he wants. Maybe that's true. And so I think the broader point is here. Something has changed. I think it has continued to develop. And obviously these Democrats they do not want Antifa style Chaz and insurrectionary violence in their cities. Anything to add there?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for standing by. Next question, Jared. Why do we still allow unions? They're corrupt, interfere with free markets, and are hotbeds of communism, socialism. I don't know. Listen, I don't know, but this is something that everyone should know. Oh gosh, what's this guy's name? His name was John Lewis. Not that John Lewis. It's a different John Lewis. Saul Alinsky wrote a biography of this guy named John Lewis, who used to run the conference of CIO. Hang on one second. He founded or used to run CIO. It's the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And Saul Alinsky was obviously a leftist, but this John Lewis guy, even though he ran these unions, he was a conservative. And Saul Alinsky said that John Lewis was his mentor, because one thing that John Lewis did is when he came in and he tried to come in and build these unions, he would hire communist and socialist organizers. And Saul Alinsky asked him one day, he said, you know what, you're a conservative guy trying to build these unions. Why are you hiring communists to go and organize these unions for you? And John Lewis, I forget the exact quote. I'm sorry. I'll have to look it up. But basically John Lewis said, yeah, we tried hiring like conservative or pro-union organizers, and they're terrible. They don't work. So we have to go in and hire the communists because they're so good at it. So it's kind of not related to your question, but it just reminded me that's a very interesting part of that book. And in terms of why do we still allow unions? I guess because they're legal. I don't know. That's kind of a philosophical question. I can't answer that, Jonathan. But Robert, do you have a perspective on this?
Well, I think there was, I think the right to work thing, which was a deliberate push in a lot of red states, was an effort to tamp down on the influence of unions. I think the problem with that is obviously it's not nationwide. And there is a lot of the reason why blue states are big, blue states and Democrats are big on unions, is that it is a voter base. It's a power base, and it can be used for other types of political activism. I don't think all unions are full of communists and socialists. That is a deliberate effort on the part of these different communist parties, CPUSA, PSL, etc., to get into, they view the unions as a center of gravity. And so obviously they're trying to take them over. But I think the reason why, other than First Amendment protections and free association, etc., is that Democrats view it as a major center of gravity for building and maintaining political power.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that's a fair point. And I looked this up, by the way. It's called John L. Lewis, an unauthorized biography by Saul Alinsky. And I wrote a post on this, and I just looked it up. And Alinsky wrote, Lewis used these communist organizers to win the toughest union battles and organize the biggest worker strikes because they were so much more effective than other organizers. And he was questioned. Saul Alinsky asked him, why does he employ communists to organize? And Lewis said, who gets the bird, the hunter or the dog? So if you've ever done any duck hunting or upland game hunting, the dog is just a tool. The dog goes out and gets the bird and brings it to you. You get the bird. So I thought that was an interesting observation. Thanks for standing by, Robert. Next question, Jared. All right, I'm following the leader of our small red towns 5051 protest group. While posts have until now emphasized peaceful protests, there's now posting about assuming Zim or Zur will be shot in the revolution and hoping that the group can, quote, show up similarly to Minneapolis. Do I still assume this is still a 5051 group? And are they ratcheting up the violence, or are they following another group, or is it even important to define the group? Well, I draw a distinction between 5051 and indivisible. And indivisible has continued to stress nonviolence, nonviolent actions, what they call strategic non-cooperation or strategic nonviolence. I can't say the same for 5051. It seems like indivisible is very not just organized, but it seems like they are very disciplined with their narrative and the things that they say. And it seems to me like the 5051 groups are a little closer to, maybe there's some loose cannons in those groups, since it's pretty much just like, hey, show up and start a 5051 group and great, now you're in the club. So I don't, obviously don't know exactly what your situation is, but I would just remind everyone, we're entering into phase 2 of this color revolution movement. Phase 1 is protest. Phase 2 is active resistance or organized resistance or strategic resistance. And so when they say stuff like that, like, oh, I'm going to get shot in the revolution. Yeah, maybe that is their expectation. And I think it does go to show that phase 3 is revolution. Phase 2 is not revolution. It is resistance. Phase 3 is revolution. And obviously we are seeing a tacit admission that is exactly what's going on. So great observation. Jared, can you bring that question up again? Great observation there. And I would just say, continue to have that in the back of your mind. The goal for you and everyone else watching is counter organization. You have to counter organize. They're trying to organize the middle against you, and you cannot just sit back and allow that to happen. This is something that the Trump administration needs to understand. This is something every American needs to understand. You have to counter organize against these people. So you have to be setting up your own local efforts to oppose these groups. And the question is, okay, Mike, I kind of get that. That makes sense. How do I do that? Well, just stand by. I'm still working on this like, a lot of this stuff I talk about in the 30,000 foot view. Okay. Like the phases of color revolution, that's strategic. That's like big picture, long-term, national level stuff. What we're talking about with counter organizing is way more applicable to the 1,000 foot view or the 500 foot view, to you locally and in your county. And I've talked about some examples of community organizing. We won't get into it again, but I will work on doing a video that you can go back and reference, and maybe we'll even do a webinar on counter organizing, the things that you can be doing against this. What is clearly, plainly, obviously a revolutionary movement that is building right now. And posts like that on your 5051 group. Great observation. And, keep up the good work. Keep up monitoring the local level. It doesn't matter how many members of Congress you can name or what you know about, as I say, Nancy Pelosi's husband's boyfriend. Your knowledge on that stuff does not matter at all. Your knowledge of the local terrain, the local threat environment, what these local groups are doing, that is ultimately what matters, because that's going to affect you. You potentially could have some influence over that. You can't have influence over the national level, but you can have influence over your neighborhood and potentially your county. So that's what you should be aiming for. All right, Jared, next question. We'll do a couple more questions. Do you think the current administration is capable to win this internal war / low intensity conflict, or at least stop the surge, or is it up to the next administration? All right, well, let's talk about capacity, since you mentioned capable. If you're the Trump administration, you're trying to retain capacity and grow capacity. If you're the other side, if you're the resistance movement or the color revolutionary movement or insurgency or whatever you want, whatever you think they are, their job is to reduce the capacity of the Trump administration to deal with this. And so when we look at certain tactics like this IO battle, this narrative campaign, information operations, they're trying to radicalize the middle against ICE, radicalize the middle against the Trump administration. And they do that because the more opposition they build, the more legitimacy, authority, and capacity they can sap from the administration. Remember, those are the three things that a government or any authority has to retain if they want to stay in power. They start to lose those things. It's like a three-legged stool. You lose one of those things, you're going to tip over. You start to lose all three, your stool's going to be pretty short. So in terms of, are they capable? Here, another big, this is just massive. Another massive issue that the administration will have, if they do adopt some coherent counterinsurgency strategy or counter resistance or counter whatever strategy, is they have to do this stuff within the letter of the law, or they should do this stuff within the letter of the law. Do they have the tools they need? I think they do have the tools they need right now as the law exists to make a dent, to start working and effectively targeting what is happening. But traditionally, or I would say historically, these things are not fought within the letter of the law. So I would say I'll leave it there, and I'll think about giving you a better answer. I would just say, typically you see new laws passed and you see massive expansion of executive authority during color revolutions, during most or all forms of low intensity conflict, because typically in a small d democracy or small r Republican system, typically constrained governments do not have exactly what they need to do what they need to do within the letter of the law. This is why this is so important. This is way bigger than just some protests. I mean, we're really talking about the future of the entire country here. And so I don't know, man, TBA, I'll say that. I just to reiterate, I think they have the tools that they need to begin work. And the more successful they are earlier in this phase or earlier in this campaign, you call it, or this movement, the more successful they'll be. Remember, insurgencies are easiest to stop in the first phase while they are organizing, before they have set up all the infrastructure that they need, before they've recruited, trained cadres, comms infrastructure, funding, training, facilitation, all the things that they need, before they have developed the three main components of an insurgency or an organized resistance. Because remember, they share those three main components: auxiliary, underground, and guerrillas, in various flavors. The question, I think, honestly, the main question is not, does the administration have the capacity, or are they capable? It is, are they doing enough in the first phase, or did they do enough in the first phase to brunt the full force of this movement, or to begin to exhaust this movement? That's one of the questions I asked a few weeks ago. Can this movement be exhausted? Do they have it? What the elections in 2.5, whatever some odd year, a little over 2.5 years. Or let's just call it 3 years, just to get through the 2029 transition. Can this movement be exhausted over the next 3 years? I think that's maybe that has to be a course of your strategic course of action, is to do as much as possible to exhaust the movement. Maybe, I don't know how the White House sees it. I don't even know if the White House sees that they necessarily have a problem like this. Those are my thoughts. Next question, Jared. As part of my area study, I found a Signal chat group. What should I do with it? And to whom could I send intelligence from it? Like a local Signal chat? Well, A, congratulations. That's a great find. B, I would just sit in there and monitor it for as long as you can. I wouldn't go on Twitter and talk about it, not unless you wanted to have some strategic message attached to it. I would say just sit in there and monitor. And in terms of who to report to, you should be reporting the stuff to yourself. You are your own intelligence analyst. Don't give it to me. I can't do anything about it. You have to build a group at your local level and figure out what's going on, and then what are we going to do about it? In terms of counter organizing, I'm obviously not promoting anything illegal or unethical or immoral. But you do have to ask yourself, okay, they are planning this campaign. They're talking about doing this stuff. They're talking about building support. They're talking about recruiting. They're talking about going to this place and talking to these people to try to recruit them or get their support for their anti-ICE campaign, or for the revolution, or for whatever seditious activity they're up to. The question for you is, how do we counter? Can we counter this, or how do we counter this? And, I'm not a PSYOP guy, but I know some. And I think we should be having a national discussion on this. So first of all, congrats. Second, I would just say, keep that close hold, continue to monitor for as long as you can, take notes, take screenshots, get on, there's a thing called a software called Analyst Notebook. I talked about it earlier in the show. And I don't know how expensive that is, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty pricey. It's a link analysis tool where you can, you know what? I need to show y'all just an example of this. Here, do y'all have 2 seconds? Here, I was working on this yesterday. If it's okay with you, I'm going to share this screen, and I didn't plan to do this. So just give me 2 seconds and let me zoom out a little bit here. Let me see if I can share the screen. There is software called Maltego, and I've used Maltego for probably like 10 years now. I love Maltego. All right, this is an example of a link analysis chart. So we have individuals here, these little green people. We have places, like this is a high school in Minneapolis. This is the Whipple Federal Building. This is a vehicle ramming. This person right here was arrested for this vehicle ramming. This is a vehicle obstruction. So this person was arrested and is affiliated with this. And we have this disruption right here, this event. And as you can see, all these people right here, they are all connected to it. And some of these people are connected to 2 separate events. And so this is the kind of stuff that you need to be building out on your local level, because when it comes time to, let's just say counter these people, you have to know what you're up against. You have to understand this stuff at your local level. Your county sheriff doesn't. Your local police certainly don't. They don't know this stuff. They're not doing this stuff. It's not their jobs right now. They're probably trying to stop hopefully trying to stop thieves, not be thieves. Nobody's doing this stuff. You have to be doing this stuff. And right, Maltego, you can buy like the entry level thing for like, it's $170 or something like that a year, and you get access to all this stuff. But even if you just have to use like PowerPoint or something, like my first tour in 2006, we didn't have analyst notebook, or maybe we did and I didn't know about it. I just got on a PowerPoint presentation and I just started drawing squares, text boxes, and writing names in there and say, oh, Muhammad, this guy's connected to Abdullah. And, oh, we got a new guy on here. Okay, well, let me move all these pictures around and add this guy on here. And now it's like, oh, these 5 guys are connected. This is a direct action cell. This is an IED cell. And here's the name of the commander. And now we can start supporting the targeting process to wipe these people out, to take them off the board. So all this stuff these are all things that you need to be doing at the local level. Hope that makes sense to everyone. Guys, that's going to be, Jared, are there any other good questions? I have indivisible in that area. How to identify 5051? Probably the best place to start is on Reddit. That is where most of them exist. They put out all these calls to action. There's a lot of local 5051 groups. I don't think 5051 is as organized. They're certainly not as disciplined as Indivisible, but that's a very good place to start. I mean, otherwise you should be looking on Instagram, Blue Sky, Mastodon. I don't know. There's probably like 10 or 12 other places where they may be congregating. Just do a search. Just hop on there and start searching around. Find those social media accounts, take screenshots, gather this information, and start building this picture of exactly what you're up against at the local level. Everyone, thanks so much for watching. We appreciate your support. Have a great rest of your day. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show, starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.